Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty intricate, trauma responses.
It can be a pretty complex topic.
Yeah, and we're diving deep, specifically into the work of Peter Walker and complex PTSD.
Definitely. His work really changed the game in understanding how trauma, especially from childhood, can have such a huge impact.
Huge, and like echoes throughout your whole life, right?
Exactly.
So we've mentioned his book before, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, but today we are laser focused on chapter 6.
Yeah, that's a really interesting chapter.
He lays out this framework, right,
hmm
for understanding how people respond to trauma.
He does, and it goes beyond, just listing out responses. It's really about understanding the nuances of those responses.
So true. The why, the how, even how they mix together, which we're going to get into.
Well, we are hybrids.
Yes. But first, let's start with the foundation. The core idea Walker presents is this concept of the 4 Fs.
The 4 Fs, classic.
Right. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. These are like our primal responses to danger. It's not like we consciously choose them. They just happen.
It's instinctual. We all have them to some degree.
Even those of us, and hopefully most of us, who didn't have particularly traumatic childhoods.
Even then.
So it's not really about whether or not we experience these Fs, but more about...
It's about the intensity.
Exactly. And how they show up in our lives.
Right. How they manifest. And how they can be both positive and negative.
Right. Like fight, sometimes you need to fight.
Absolutely.
So could you talk a little bit more about that, about how each of these Fs can be healthy?
Sure. So with fight, like you said, sometimes you need to advocate for yourself. Set boundaries. Like if someone cuts you in line, you might need a little fight to be like, hey, I was here first.
Yeah, totally. And flight.
Flight can be about strategically disengaging from a situation. Like, when an argument is just getting too heated.
Oh, yeah.
And it's better to just step back, take a breather. That's flight.
So it's not always about physically running away. It's about knowing when to step back.
Exactly.
What about freeze?
Freeze can be about pausing before you react. That split second where you take a breath and assess the situation before responding. That can be freeze. It allows for a more thoughtful response.
So instead of just reacting impulsively, you give yourself a moment.
Right. And then there's fawn.
This one I feel like resonates with a lot of people that need to please.
Fawn is often about wanting to create harmony, being empathetic, genuinely caring for others.
Which are all good things.
They are good things.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that these responses, these Fs, they're not inherently bad.
Not at all. In fact, they help us navigate the world, especially in those moments of stress or danger.
Right. But there's always a but, right?
There is.
It's when these become our default, our go-to in every situation, whether it's appropriate or not.
Exactly. And that usually stems from childhood trauma.
So when those dials get cranked up too high, that's when things can become problematic.
Right. They go from being helpful tools to
being more like defense mechanisms.
defense mechanisms that are really running the show.
And we end up kind of stuck in survival mode, even when we're not actually in danger.
Right. Our nervous system is basically stuck in overdrive.
So then how does that manifest when, let's say, the fight response becomes this dominant mode of operating?
Well, someone with a really strong fight response, you might see controlling behaviors, difficulty being vulnerable, maybe even a need to always be right.
So think like needing to control every aspect of a project, never being able to admit fault, pushing away loved ones when they try to get close.
Exactly.
Wow. And what about flight? How does that over-reliance on flight show up?
Flight often looks like staying busy all the time, like constantly working, overscheduling, filling every waking moment with something to do.
Because if they stop,
Then they have to face what they're running from, those uncomfortable emotions, memories, all of it.
so it's like they're running from their own internal world.
In a way, they are.
What about freeze? That one seems particularly, I don't know, isolating in a way.
It can be. People stuck in freeze might struggle to express their needs, set boundaries. Social situations can be really hard because they're so afraid of being hurt or rejected.
It's almost like they're shutting down to protect themselves.
Their nervous system is essentially saying, okay, to stay safe, we don't engage, we don't react.
And lastly, we have fawn. I think a lot of people, especially those who grew up in certain family dynamics, might really resonate with this one.
Fawn is all about putting everyone else's needs before your own. People-pleasing, seeking validation, struggling to say no.
And in a way, it makes sense, right? Like if your survival depended on...
On keeping the peace, on not rocking the boat.
Exactly.
Then, of course, you're going to learn to prioritize other people's needs above your own.
But as adults, this can be so draining because you're constantly giving, giving, giving without receiving anything in return.
It's a recipe for burnout and resentment.
Absolutely. So we've talked about these 4F responses individually, but what happens when someone doesn't fit neatly into just one box? What if they see themselves in a combination of these?
That's where things get even more interesting. Because most people aren't just one F.
Right. It's not like a personality test where you're like, oh, I'm a fight.
Exactly. We're complex. We've got layers, and our experiences, especially in childhood, can lead to a blending of these responses, which is where Walker's concept of trauma hybrids comes in.
Trauma hybrids. Okay, I am intrigued. So paint me a picture. What might this look like in real life?
Okay, so let's take, for example, the fight-fawn hybrid. This might be someone who, on the surface, is incredibly charming, helpful, always willing to lend a hand.
Seems like a great friend.
Right. But underneath, they're using those qualities to manipulate others, avoid accountability, and ultimately get their needs met, even if it means stepping on toes.
Wow, so it's like they're using the fawn to get close, and then if anyone gets too close or tries to challenge them, the fight comes out.
Exactly. Or think about the flight-freeze hybrid. This could be the classic high achiever, constantly throwing themselves into work, projects, always on the go.
Classic flight.
Right. But then, the moment things get a little too real, a little too emotionally intimate, they shut down completely. They freeze.
So they're operating on these extremes, never really finding that balance.
Exactly. And these patterns can show up in so many different combinations. Like fight freeze is another common one. This might be someone who can be very domineering, critical, even aggressive.
Okay, so that's the fight.
Right. But then when they're confronted with their own behavior, they clam up, withdraw, get defensive. It's like they can dish it out, but they can't take it.
Which, again, it's not about blaming them. It's about understanding that this push and pull often stems from their own unresolved trauma.
Exactly. And it's not even always conscious. It's just how they learn to navigate the world, how they learn to stay safe.
It makes you think about those frustrating dynamics we all encounter in relationships, right? Like maybe that friend who's always got to be right, or that family member who's constantly on the go. There's often a deeper reason for these behaviors.
Absolutely. And just having that awareness, that understanding, can make a huge difference in how we approach those relationships.
So let's talk about recovery. We've delved into the what and the why of these trauma responses. But what about the how? How can someone start to heal these wounds and create healthier patterns in their lives?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, the first and most important step I can offer is seek professional help. Find a therapist who specializes in trauma. They can provide the support and guidance you need to navigate this journey safely and effectively.
That makes sense. I mean, we're talking about deeply ingrained patterns, often rooted in early childhood experiences. Trying to unpack all of that on your own could be incredibly overwhelming.
It can be. A therapist can provide that safe, non-judgmental space to explore these patterns, understand their origins, and most importantly, develop healthier coping mechanisms.
So therapy is definitely crucial. But are there other tools, other strategies people can use in their everyday lives to support their healing?
Absolutely. Things like somatic experiencing, EMDR eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing those can be incredibly effective.
I've heard amazing things about both of those therapies, but I'm not as familiar with them. Can you explain a little bit about how they work?
Sure. So somatic experiencing focuses on releasing trauma that's stored in the body. Because trauma isn't just an emotional or mental experience, it impacts us physically too.
It makes so much sense, like our body holds on to that trauma.
Exactly. And somatic experiencing uses different techniques to help release that tension, that stuck energy.
And EMDR.
EMDR is a bit different. It uses bilateral stimulation, like eye movements, to help the brain process traumatic memories.
It's like it's helping the brain reprocess those experiences in a healthier way.
Exactly. And then, beyond those specific therapies, there are practices you can incorporate into your daily life that can be super helpful. Things like mindfulness, self-compassion.
Those sound great, but I'm curious, how do they actually relate to trauma recovery? Like, what does mindfulness actually look like in action?
Okay, so imagine you're feeling triggered. Maybe someone said something that just brought up a whole wave of emotions. Instead of getting swept away by those emotions, mindfulness allows you to observe them without judgment. You create space between the trigger and your reaction.
So it's like you're pressing pause on that automatic response.
Exactly. You're giving yourself a moment to choose how you want to respond rather than just reacting from that old, wounded place. And that's where self-compassion comes in. It's about being kind to yourself, especially when you're struggling.
Instead of beating yourself up for reacting a certain way, you're offering yourself understanding.
Yes, you're acknowledging that you're on a journey, that healing isn't linear, and that it's okay to stumble along the way.
It's like offering ourselves the same grace we would offer a good friend.
Exactly. And that's huge because often the way we talk to ourselves, the inner critic, is way harsher than anything anyone else could say.
That's so true. So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, it seems like a key takeaway is that understanding these trauma responses isn't about labeling ourselves or others. It's about developing compassion.
100%. It's not about saying, oh, you're a fight type, so you're always going to be this way. It's about recognizing patterns, understanding tendencies, and approaching ourselves and others with a little more grace.
Yeah, and maybe through that increased understanding, we can start to interrupt those cycles of reactivity and create more fulfilling, connected relationships.
Absolutely. That's the goal.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a quick pause. When we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive with some final insights and takeaways for our listeners. And we're back. For this last part of our deep dive, I want to shift gears just a bit, from understanding to action.
Love it. Because knowledge without action, it's kind of like, no, it doesn't really get us anywhere, does it?
It's true. So for someone listening who's like, okay, this resonates, I see myself in these patterns, where do I even begin? What's that first step towards change?
You know, a powerful first step is really getting to know your own triggers. Like, what are those specific situations or people or even those thoughts that pop into your head that kind of flip that switch and activate your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response?
So it's about becoming almost like a detective of your own inner world, right?
Exactly. Pay attention. Notice those patterns.
And then once you start to recognize those triggers, what then?
That's when you can start experimenting with different ways of responding. So let's say you realize, okay, every time I have to go to a big social gathering, I totally freeze up.
It happens.
Right. Instead of just avoiding every party invite, you can try some grounding techniques beforehand, like deep breathing exercises, visualizing a calming image, things that can help soothe your nervous system, you know.
So you're basically giving yourself a game plan.
Exactly. Or maybe you notice that every time you talk to a certain person, you automatically fall into that people-pleasing fawn mode.
Oh, I know that one.
Right. So instead of just letting that pattern run the show, you can start setting some boundaries, practicing saying no, prioritizing your own needs for once.
So it's like you're taking back your power. You're saying, hey, those old survival mechanisms, they might not be serving me anymore.
Exactly. You have a choice. You can choose a different path.
And that's empowering. But it's also, I imagine, really challenging.
Oh, absolutely. It takes time and practice. And this is where self-compassion is so important.
It seems like that's a recurring theme for us.
It really is, because you're going to mess up. You're going to fall back into old patterns. It's inevitable. But instead of beating yourself up, you offer yourself kindness.
Grace.
Exactly, like you would a good friend.
Because we're all works in progress, right?
Always. And not just us, but everyone around us, too.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to get so caught up in our own stuff that we forget other people are dealing with their own stuff, too.
It's true. And when we can approach each other with that understanding, with that compassion,
It changes everything.
it does.
Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty deep dive on trauma responses for today.
We did.
And we covered a lot. But I hope our listeners walk away with not just a deeper understanding of these patterns, but also a sense of hope.
Yes. Healing is possible. It's a journey, not a race.
So be kind to yourselves along the way. Take it one step at a time.
One breath at a time.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.